Everyone. Welcome to our event here today. My name is Josie Smith. I am the Events and Social Media Coordinator for Madison Street Books. We are a new-ish independent bookstore in Chicago's West Loop, and we are so excited today to be hosting Lana Bastašić and Aleksandar Hemon. Lana is a Yugoslav-born writer. She majored in English and holds a master's degree in cultural studies. She's published 3 collections of short stories, 1 book of children's stories, and 1 collection of poetry. We're here today to celebrate her debut novel, Catch the Rabbit, which was awarded the 2020 European Prize for Literature, and she currently lives in Belgrade. Aleksandar Hemon is the author of The Lazarus Project, which was a finalist for the 2008 National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award. And he's also written 3 books of short stories, The Question of Bruno, Nowhere Man, which was also a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and Love and Obstacles. He was the recipient of the 2003 Guggenheim Fellowship, as well as a Genius Grant from the MacArthur Foundation, and the 2020 Dos Passos Prize, and he currently lives in Chicago.
Actually, I live in Princeton, but yes.
Princeton, my bad. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Here in the chat, feel free to converse with everyone. At the bottom of your screen, there is an Ask a Question button. If you have any questions you'd like to ask, we'll have some time at the end. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to our authors.
Thank you, Josie. It is my great pleasure to be here to talk to Lana Bastašić, with whom I share many things, not least the language, but also spaces in which we grew up in the region of former Yugoslavia, or Western Balkans. It's a kind of region that has a lot of names, and they are not always interchangeable, but they are used very often in different contexts. Speaking of language, I read the book in the original language, Bosnian or Serbian or Croatian or Montenegrin. We, by default, get to speak 4 languages for one. And also an English translation, which she did most admirably by herself. So I would like to welcome Lana Bastašić to this virtual space. It is my great pleasure to speak to you in virtual person. How are you today?
Hi, Sasha. It's really great to talk to you, and I'm happy to be here. And thank you to Madison Street Books for inviting us. I almost said no, but when they said Aleksandar Hemon, I was like, okay, yes, whatever.
Well, I would have said no if it wasn't for you, really, because I'm in Florida, really, on my family vacation. So, speaking of hot, I would like to say a few things about the books, and as we say in Bosnia, don't let me lie. So if I misrepresent something, stop me. And I will take that duty upon myself, because when we're communicating before, you seem to be allergic to kind of elevator pitches of your book. The book has been out for a while now in Europe, in the Balkans, and in Western Europe. How many languages has been translated in?
I think for now we have 9 out, and there are 4 on the way.
So if you want me, I'll take it upon myself to do the elevator pitch.
Yes, please do, because it's such an American thing, and I think you're a bit more American than I am.
Yeah, I'll make it a very slow elevator. It is a story about 2 young women who grew up together in the part of Bosnia Lana's from, and by the way, my family's from, Banja Luka, where in the 90s during the war, people of non-Serb background vanished or were outright killed. And one of the 2 friends is of Muslim background. The other one is of Serbian background. The word war is never used in the book, but the story is about their reconnecting, or at least one part of the story, 12 years after their last meeting, which allows the narrator, who lives in Dublin, her name is Sarah, to come to Bosnia and take a trip with Layla, her friend, to Vienna, where they believe, or so we believe too, Layla's brother Armin resurfaced. They believed he disappeared during the war years. And now they are driving together to Vienna, reconnecting and disconnecting, as it were, and which also allows the narrator to remember and reminisce and reinterpret their childhood years. Is that a fair description? It's a good. We're on now on the 25th floor, so that's it. That's all I have. But I would like you. I talked to you, and I've read your interviews and watched your interviews, and it's also obvious from the book that you are a thinking writer. That is, you know what you're doing most of the time. In other words, it's not a spontaneous outpouring emotion that is then printed, right? So I would like you to tell us a bit about the evolution of the ideas that are and formal and intellectual and political and any range of ideas that emerged in the process of your devising and writing the book.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a lot of things. Now it's hard to talk because it was years ago. I'm sure it happens to you when you have to talk about a book
Just make stuff up
after. You feel like you're a different person already, and that's already kind of a Lewis Carroll topic. But I would try to remember who I was back then. I had been living in Barcelona for some years, and I had been trying to deal with things that I left in the past behind me. You know, I was this person who left Bosnia, who wanted to build her life somewhere else in a different language. And I thought that I would like to do something with this, but find my own way to do it. And at the same time, I was rereading Alice in Wonderland. And suddenly, you know, I started noticing certain connections, which might seem weird, like who notices connections between their own childhood and Alice's adventures in Wonderland. But when you grow up as a little girl in Bosnia, there are certainly some connections. And I thought this could be a nice, first I thought of it as an exercise to tell the story of, you know, women growing up in Bosnia through Alice, and then I started thinking about Layla, and you know what it would be like to be, or what it would have been like for me if I'd been a Muslim woman or a little girl in Banja Luka, and pretty soon I realized this cannot be just a short story. It's kind of too big. Just the scope is too vast. And I'm going to have to write a novel. I didn't want to, but I'm going to have to do it. So then the idea of a road trip kind of just made sense because I wanted to play with the place, with the territory, and also certain towns and places in Bosnia, and not just Bosnia, that could help me tell the story better, and also say something about Yugoslavia from the point of view of my generation, which is a bit different. So yeah, I had all of these different elements, but as you said, it wasn't, I don't work like that, like I sit down and I let the muses sing to me. And then it all just kind of pours out. I really have to think, and I really have to work. I'm not a genius, I work. I guess it's this communist background. And so I kind of connected all those dots and ties, and just I just had it, and it just made sense. I would have a road trip, Alice in Wonderland, and growing up in Bosnia, and that's kind of how it started. You're better than me. Talking about you talk.
I think that's most fascinating. I have a lot of questions, but I thought just to give a chance to people who have not read your book in any of the languages to have a sense of what it sounds like, that I would ask you to read for a few minutes. I suggested a scene, but any scene that you choose to read would be excellent. Could you do that for us?
Yes, definitely. Just somebody says that there's some echo. Is it when I'm talking? Maybe I should just lower the volume. I hope this is better. So I'm gonna read in English from chapter 4. This is the moment when my narrator arrives in Mostar, which is in southern Bosnia, and this is where she finally reunites with Layla. So here it is. I can't, not even for the sake of the story, remember how I managed to find the small restaurant where she worked. I only remember how Mostar glimmered like a polished jug, though the day was inexplicably gloomy in spite of the unbearable heat. I remember tourists and their synthetic parasols. They spread across the old bridge like a wreath of plastic flowers on an important grave. I saw her before I realized I was looking at her. In front of the low wooden fence, a couple of pink-skinned tourists snapped photos of the hostesses in traditional clothes. One of them pursed her lips and sent a toneless kiss to the fat Austrian's iPhone. The other, her smile automatized for the photo, looked down at two fat cats next to her clog. They were enjoying a discarded rib of a less lucky animal. She stared at them as if envying their being on the ground, with their loose bellies and oily whiskers, completely naked, while she was boiling in her Ottoman noblewoman's costume, borrowed from 3 separate centuries. The outline of 2 scrawny legs, like a small ostrich's, was visible under heavy pastel blue damier, with gilded threads hanging undone. A red wonder bra could be seen under the coarse white cotton shirt. She had forgotten to button her yaterma, which would have covered that chronological slip. A braid, bleached white against the violet katifa, climbed the velvet material and disappeared under the red fez in its crumpled kerchief. She was standing like that, entranced by those vulgar cats, like some cosmopolitan version of Hanna Pechlivana from the old song, without her fereja over to protect her modesty, without her captain, without the verses, as thin waiters dressed as bays and merchants jumped around her with Parisian steaks and fries on their round engraved trays. That's when I recognized her. Red lips in a crooked smile for the accidental camera, the tiny mole next to the made-up eye, an elbow raised in order to scratch the armpit under sweaty cotton. It was her, Layla, still grand under the exaggerated props, still spiteful and sweaty, and of this century, regardless of all the previous ones stacked on her shoulders. It was her, like that day on the beach. I don't know if that's enough.
That's a beautiful passage.
Thanks.
I just want to say that if I have my microphone on and you're speaking, there's an echo. So after I ask a question, I will turn myself off. And if I speak and produce no sounds, wave at me. That's a beautiful passage in many ways. One of the reasons I was going to ask you about that in many other respects is that it kind of actualizes the whole notion of identity, right? Layla is performing her identity for tourists. And the theme of identity is scattered, it's all over the book. It's not scattered, it's essential to the book. Her names change because of different reasons. The narrator, Sarah, lives in Dublin, right? She has an issue with her displacement, let's say. Lives with a guy named Michael. And not to make it autobiographical in any way, but rather sort of to point at the essential quality of that theme is that you were born in Zagreb, you're a Bosnian writer who lives in Belgrade, who also spent a lot of time in Barcelona and spent much of this year in Zurich. And so you're itinerant in so many ways. So could you talk a little about the issue of identity as refracted in your book, as you thought through it in the book?
Yeah, well, definitely. It was one of the most important issues for me. Not that I was thinking I'm going to write a book about identity, but it kind of just on its own became a very, very important theme in the book, because I mean, I have experienced this, sorry, having difficulty just answering the question, where are you from? And, you know, trying to tell, you know, where do you start? Which century do you start in? And I'm sure you've had the same problem, you know, like, how do you even begin to explain to people? Like, do I ask them to take a map out? And then, you know, what exactly does that mean about you? What does it say about you to be from this place or some other place? And I wanted that to be part of the book. And then especially for Layla, who for me is the central character in the book, or at least the central force, who has kind of been everything. And it's always somebody else who puts this tag on her. Okay, your name is Muslim, now your name is Serbian, and now it's acceptable. Then she gets married, and she has a Croatian surname, and she also changes the way she looks. She changes her hair, you know, she puts contacts, etc. So she doesn't have a stable sense of who she is because of all this. And I wanted to try to catch this feeling of how does my narrator even begin to understand another human being who doesn't even understand herself. You know, I always say, you know, how in the States you have all these MFA programs, and I always like to say this, how all of them will tell you have to know your character. Well, I wanted to do precisely the opposite, which is to say, how do you talk about somebody that you cannot know? I don't think you can ever know another human being. So what is my narrator going to do? She's going to try and guess what it's like to live through that experience. And of course, me having this kind of strange, meandering biography, I could really take from that experience and put into Layla's character this inability to kind of to be caught. She doesn't really let herself be caught, even if she wants to. It's funny because, you know, my mom always says when they ask her about her kids, the questions are usually, you know, about my brother, like how are his kids, and for my sister, like how is her job, and then the question for me is, and where is Lana now? So it's like, that's always the question, because they just assume that I'm so this kind of restlessness I wanted to use. I wanted to work with that also for Layla's character, but at the same time not to appropriate her suffering, which was not my suffering, because I was privileged in Banja Luka, having the right name. But, you know, instead of appropriating, just kind of try to understand, you know, what happened to those kids. They were just kids when we were kids, when, you know, people just came and changed your name overnight. What does that do to a person? That was like if there's a question behind a book, when you start writing a book, for me, that was the question. Like, what happens to an 11-year-old girl when somebody just changes her name overnight and tells her, now you're something else? So all of these questions are there. I'm not sure if there are any answers, but at least I wanted to ask these questions. Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, they're still very, very important in the Balkans. You know, there's still this Alice in Wonderland question: where are you from? Who are your parents? What is your name? You know, we still think in these categories, and it's really sad, but unfortunately, it's still relevant.
I have to make a full disclosure that Lana's mother is a dentist to my cousin in Banja Luka. So I have a vested interest in her success.
And we didn't know.
We didn't know, that's right. I do want to ask you, in the light of what you just said, I think one of the brilliant formal decisions about the book is that essentially it has a dialogical form. Not only is it between two friends and they talk a lot, but also the narrator narrates the trip with Layla as they're going from Mostar to Vienna, and then reflects upon the time when they were kids, while addressing rhetorically and narratively Layla when she was 10. So the whole book is very importantly dialogical, right? So that it's not one person's, one character's consciousness or point of view and so on. So it unfolds in the form of a dialogue. Can you talk a little bit about that decision and other, let's say, formal decisions, why the book is the way it is. I mean, you've already touched upon the Alice in Wonderland, but I mean, this could easily wade into the question of influences. But I would like to hear from you first. What is it that if you can remember those decisions and the logic of those decisions?
Well, yeah, I mean, I first, as you said, I started with Alice, the 12 chapters, mirroring the 12 chapters of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. But then I wanted every chapter to have kind of two sides that could mirror each other, so that I would have the frame story, which is the road trip. So that would kind of show the spatial dimension and traveling through space. From the south of Bosnia to Vienna, and then the other side, the other part of the chapter would deal with the temporal dimension, and it would be a kind of journey into their shared past, and would not be linear in that way, but would kind of jump back and forth. And then I decided that, of course, the narrative voice has to be a bit different, even though it's the same narrator. There's a difference between the one who's describing the journey, or whatever now is, and the one who's going back, so that every time she goes back, she more and more starts sounding like that child that she was when that memory happened. So if Sada is describing, the time when she killed a sparrow when she was 8, I wanted that voice to start, slowly, little by little, sounding like an 8-year-old girl's. So these were some decisions, and then I also made this decision precisely because of what you said, that the journey, the road trip part, would be told in the third person. Well, first person, Sarah is speaking, but she's talking about Layla as her, and the childhood memories part would be told in a you, the second person singular form. This, on one hand, I just feel like it takes the reader closer to the story. It kind of puts the reader in Layla's shoes, and this was important to me because I think when it comes to the road trip part, Layla can maybe at times be too much, and sometimes the reader can feel annoyed or irritated. We only get Sarah's point of view, and there's this obnoxious friend over the top. So I wanted the reader also to have moments where he or she can identify with Layla and live through her memories too, and maybe be closer to her in that way. So, so as not to judge her so quickly. So that was, and also, of course, to establish this close connection between the narrator and her friend, because I think there's just something so intimate about you when you use that pronoun, and that is the step that Sarah makes from being just a narrator and talking about a she to actually dealing head on with trauma and with this very complex friendship. So these were some of the writerly reasons why it happened. And also it just kind of, when you, I don't know if it happens to you, but when something just makes sense and it comes to you in that voice, and it just has to be told in that voice from that point of view. So I kind of just decided to trust that instinct.
No, of course, you understand why that it needs to be done that way, and then you might understand why after you have done it that way, right? And in other words, you figure it out by way of doing it. I think it's an excellent
and
choice.
Then you do a lot of talks like this, so you can come up with fancy reasons to justify.
You come up with an aesthetic, which is useful, which I think why it is good to have things like this, not just for the audience who gets more familiar with the book, but also sort of to stand up by your aesthetics. Another thing I want to ask you, and it aligns with this dialogical sensibility, let's say, is that you translate, let me ask you this way, you translated the book yourself. I used to do it once many years ago, and it was a terrible translation. Your translation is very, very good. And it was a terrible translation. I've never done it since because I could not tell apart the languages as they were in my head, right? The same thoughts were the thoughts. And so I mistranslated quite a few things because I knew what I thought. I didn't need to explain it to myself.
I'm sorry,
And
were you translating into Bosnian, Serbo-Croatian?
I was translated my early stories into Bosnian from English.
Okay, okay.
And so
I'm curious.
yes,
Let's
it was.
talk about usage.
We'll talk about it some other time. But I want to ask you about, you studied English language and literature. You're a huge Joyce fan, which I also share with you. And Sarah is importantly coming from an English-speaking country, right? Ireland. She lives in Dublin. So talk to me about your relationship with the English language and your experience of translating your own book.
Well, I guess maybe for me it was easier because I never really lived in an English-speaking country. I never really developed that kind of intimate connection that I think you have with English because of so many different things. So for me, it was always something. It was always like some sort of material that I could work with. And whenever I have to write an essay or something on a nonfiction, I like to use English. And of course, having studied English literature, the way I read and think about books is very much informed by those texts. Thanks to my grandmother, there's also a lot of Russians, but I mean, first they were, the great English writers, the classics. And the decision to translate, it was really a kind of survival tactic in a way. I was living in Barcelona. I wrote my first draft in a language that none of my friends spoke. I met writers and translators, but I didn't really exist in that city as a writer. And I realized that if I want to show this manuscript to a publisher in Barcelona or elsewhere in Europe, it has to be translated into one of these so-called big languages, right? I think our language is very big and beautiful, but unfortunately, there are some that are more popular in the market. So the thing is that I just thought, like, this is the only way for me to exist as a writer out there, because I've talked about this a lot. There is a kind of firewall when it comes to being a young woman writer in the Balkans. It's like this crazy video game where there's some angry old guy at every level waiting to say, okay, stop here. And I mean, not just me, but like even some, older colleagues with, who have done more and better. They've experienced this. So I was thinking I would have to wait to get some award, which, no woman has, like 5 women have won in 70 years. Then I would have to wait for somebody to recommend me. Then I would have to wait for somebody to find him. I mean, it's never going to happen. And I don't want to, sit around and whine about my sad destiny. So I'm going to do this. And then what happened is that I translated my very early draft, first or second draft. And then while translating, I could see the things that I didn't like that weren't really working. Because now I had this distance, with your native tongue, you're very close to it. And things are going to, sneak through sentences and you're not going to see them. But when you translate it into another language, which isn't my own, then you have this distance and then you can see there's a lot of dead weight here. And, I have to weed out all of these things. So I was going back and forth. And translating actually helped me make the manuscript much better. So they were kind of, growing together. And in the end, it was that manuscript, in English that got me an agent, and things started happening for me. I wasn't expecting them to actually publish my translation. I was constantly saying, please find a real translator. Somehow it feels like you're cheating. I don't know. It's so strange. But in the end, they liked the text, both the American and the English publishers. So So it's just, I never really thought it would happen, but yeah, that's the story.
Well, it's an excellent and most impressive story. I mean, I'm sure you know that Nabokov essentially rewrote his early stories in English, right? They're not really translation. And just it's most fascinating, and it fueled some of my arguments about being multilingual and bilingual, that you wrote it effectively in two languages, that combining two languages was a methodology to develop the book that is most fascinating. Totally. Speaking, I watched your conversations and interviews online, and one of the things that made me excited about this conversation, because of course, good interviews cause you to want to ask more questions. So one of the issues is the presence of women writers in the Balkans culture, the culture of the Balkans, right? And it's closely entangled with the nationalism that has ravaged our lives for generations, because nationalism is essentially a male operation, right? In nationalist discourse, women are there to provide more warriors and to land their wombs for the national cause, which is why they have to be controlled by the nationalist patriarchy. So I want to, and unfortunately, there are few women writers in the tradition, not because there were no women writers, but because patriarchy suppressed those voices in various ways, directly or indirectly. I mean, legally or just culturally. So one of the comparisons that comes up when people talk about Catch the Rabbit is Elena Ferrante, particularly the Naples tetralogy, where the friendship between two women is followed for about, 60 years. And in your book, there's a scene with an earthquake, as there is in the Elena Ferrante book, which is, I hope, that's a wonderful homage to Elena Ferrante. Could you talk not only about your relationship and thoughts about Elena Ferrante, but what women writers do you communicate with when you think about literature?
Well, I mean, I guess I try to communicate with writers in general whose work inspired me and moved me, and of course, many of those writers are women, and you know, in our tradition, a writer I admire greatly and a great friend of mine, and somebody I'm sure people have heard of is Dubravka Ugrešić. Especially, I mean, I love her novels, but it was her essays that really got me hooked. There's a great book that I always recommend. It's called Culture of Lies, and it's really it's a book of essays, and it really portrays really well the atmosphere of the early 90s, just before the war, and kind of this madness started. So she's definitely one of those writers. But then, of course, since I studied English literature, Virginia Woolf played a major part, and just it might, you know, it's funny when you mention your influences and then you compare the books and you say there's nothing in common here, but actually just the way she deals with time and her obsession with how to capture time and capture a moment, and you know, movement, and the way the human mind works. This is something that for me was very, very important. And then when it comes to Ferrante, I was for a long time, I was like in love with Elsa Morante, another Italian writer. I mean, I hope people knew about her as much as they do about Elena Ferrante. But I was reading Morante a lot, and then I heard about this new Italian writer, and this novel had just come out in English, and it was called Days of Abandonment. It was a very short, by Europa Editions, very short novel by Elena Ferrante, who I had heard nothing about. And I remember reading this short novel, and I was just completely blown away. It's really, to me, even better than the Neapolitan series. It's like a beautiful Greek play, and it was just done on I don't know, maybe like 100 or so pages. So I was reading Ferrante, but I was never, even while reading the Neapolitan, My Brilliant Friend and all the other books, I never thought I want to do this, because I just didn't find female friendship to be in any way an exotic topic. I didn't, I wasn't reading a book thinking, oh, this is female friendship, this is interesting, because it's such an everyday thing. And I was happy that somebody was writing about it. I wanted to do something, to say something about my country, about what it is like to be from Bosnia. And then once I thought, like, I want to have a narrator, and I want to have somebody on the other side who's narrated, because I was not Muslim and I didn't live through this, so I cannot appropriate this. It was a kind of equation, and I realized I need to have two. The one who's trying to understand an experience and the one who's actually experiencing it. And then, of course, you think, okay, these are two women, they have these complex relationships, and, you can draw from many, many different examples, but it wasn't really, as much as I admire Ferrante, I wasn't directly thinking about, of course, there's going to be many connections, and I'm happy that there are, because I think she is amazing, but I wasn't even thinking about those books. I was actually, working with Alice, closely with Alice, stealing a lot from Joyce, stealing a lot from Lolita. You mentioned Nabokov. So I wasn't, you're not even aware. And then it wasn't until after the book came out that some critics, saw these connections and said, this is like the Bosnian My Brilliant Friend. I was like, yeah, why not? It's fine. Yeah. I hope I answered your question.
You did indeed. I just want to say that, and you talked about it too, is that there's a proclivity, particularly among men, and I'm one of them. I mean, I'm one of the men, to sort of relegate women's writing to women's writing, right? Men's writing is universal, whereas women, they have their own little, corner, and then they do their women's stuff. And of course, I do find it deplorable, and you've talked about it eloquently, and please talk about it again. It is easy to compare writing of two women if they have women characters, because unfortunately, inescapably, it's a story of women in patriarchy. And that instantly, whereas men can be universal because they don't think they live in patriarchy or history, for that matter, particularly nationalist men. Women's writing yields itself to comparison because of this unfortunate structural quality, as it were. And so this is why I didn't think that you were, copying Elena Ferrante, but there is a communication, because you've talked about your position as a writer in a particular society, or particular societies even, right? Particular history and cultures, right? That you have to contend with, that someone like me does not have to contend directly with, right? I can think about it, but I can be universal, or pretend to be universal. I'm asking this because I think because you have an aesthetics, or it could be the other way around, you have an ethics. You do think about what literature does in communication with the readership in a society and history, right? It's not just a spontaneous outpouring of emotion that, validates those emotions. So could you talk about what you think about the role of literature in any society, or in our societies, that there's the Balkan histories and society?
Well, that's a big question. But I mean, I don't think anybody sits down thinking, now I'm going to write about women in patriarchy. I think if you have a woman in your book, and if you want to write her experience truthfully, and you're writing about Bosnia in the 90s, patriarchy and sexism and all of those things are naturally going to come up, because it's just looking and listening, trying to describe things truthfully. So I wasn't thinking, wow, I'm writing about women, and I'm writing about this is going to be a feminist book, and I'm writing about patriarchy. No, I was thinking, I'm writing about what it's like to grow up as a woman in Bosnia, and I'm trying to do it honestly. So this is what it's like, this is how it is. And I think that, it's not about telling the truth. It's about doing it truthfully. It's about looking at things truthfully. And of course, then, once the book came out, I realized, people started saying, this is the first book in our literatures that deals with female friendship. And I said, that's really sad. I don't want to celebrate that. I mean, it's just, I wish we had more books dealing with this. And then I actually sat down with a friend and we started going through the list of the NEEN Award laureates. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it used to be the most important literary prize in Yugoslavia, and now it's in Serbia. And then we realized, okay, instead of just counting up the women writers, let's count up the women, protagonists in the awarded novels. And the result was just sad, because even the women that won the award wrote about men. And that was just, that clearly tells you this is what a literary topic is in Serbia or in Yugoslavia or in the Balkans. This is literature. This is not literature. If you say, he woke up at 5, that's how a literary novel starts. She woke up at 5, that's chick lit. And somehow I feel like this is something that happens on an unconscious level. So, then you have an editor of a magazine reading this way, because he grew up, it's usually a he grew up in this kind of canon. So to him, a literary text is this kind of text. Then you have, jurors for important awards, translators, offering what to translate. It's like a whole network. And then they will tell you, well, it's just women don't really write that much here. It's not that we are sexist, it's just there aren't that many writers and they're not that good. And I think it has to do with this idea of what is literature and what isn't, and of course, if we look globally, it's not just women. They're always going to compartmentalize you. If you're not a white man, white straight man, they're going to compartmentalize you. So, you're going to be an immigrant writer forever. So they put you in this, compartment, and they kind of put our experience. Of course, we have to talk about these different experiences, but they put us in this little drawer, and then we're there and we're taking care of that. But why can't we talk about the evolution of the novel as a form? Why can't I discuss method? Why can't I be there in the big playground? No, because we have this little compartment for you. I mean, it's just the fact that this compartment exists is problematic. So I mean, for me, it's just this. I'm going to write about my experience. I'm going to do it truthfully. Had I thought, wow, I've never seen anything like this, or people don't write about this, or I haven't read books about this in my own literary tradition, I wouldn't have been able to do it. Luckily, at that point, I didn't have a publisher or an agent, and I thought I was writing for no one. So I could just write what I felt I wanted to. But yeah, it was interesting, and especially later, it was actually once the book was started to get translated and noticed abroad, that's when kind of things back home also stirred up, like, oh, well, seems like those people out there are talking about this book. Maybe we should read it too, but yeah, up until then, we had a lot of interest.
That's a nice segue into the question by one of the listeners or people in the audience. And the question is from Neira Kadic. I'm curious to hear what feedback you got from the readers on how Catch the Rabbit was received in the Balkan diaspora versus with people who live in the Balkans, and if there are any patterns of difference you are noticing.
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, there's also a difference between different countries in the Balkans, because of course, in Banja Luka, I don't know how to put this nicely, but let's just say there was a lot of enthusiasm about the book, and there's just kind of this silence. And it was really painful because, you know, I wrote a book about that town, and it takes place there, and I just felt like it belongs there, but it just, of course, still, you know, it was seen as an act of I was seen as a traitor in a way, because I'm, you know, this Serbian girl writing about some bad things that Serbs did, and Serbs never did anything bad. So there's, you know how it is. But then when it comes to our diaspora, especially in Germany, in Switzerland, and Austria, there's still a lot of nostalgia there. They're asking you to mute yourself. There's a lot of nostalgia, and I could see it was so interesting for me to meet these people who left Bosnia years ago, and their children grew up in you know, another country, and they're slowly losing their native tongue, but they still have this, you know, beautiful story in their heads about Yugoslavia. And I feel like writers like me, we perform some sort of weird catharsis for them or something. You know, they would like ask you to tell them things about, you know, the places that they used to know. And of course, they're much different from what I know, but there's still a lot of nostalgia. And then I was always very careful to explain that what I do is not nostalgic, because I don't remember that country. I cannot, I mean, it would be fake to have any sort of nostalgia. For me, it's just another story. I have to, you know, question that as well as anything else, and try to do something else. And so that was the, to answer this wonderful question, that was maybe the main difference, that the diaspora is much more nostalgic, and here it's still about, oh, but what is she, even if they haven't read the book, it's like, oh, but she's writing about Serbs and Muslims. And I always say, no, I'm writing about people. But as you know, it's just, even, you know, if you write about, I was reading your wonderful book. I have it here. So those of you who haven't read it, please get this wonderful book. But there's this this moment when you just describe your father's bees and beehives. To me, it's like, I think I cried. I don't want to spoil it for the people who are listening, but you know, what happens to those bees, that's for me such a brilliant way to just describe how war is madness. And you know, it's like, it's bees, they haven't really, what have they done? We need them to survive. And then there's this scene, you know, when I could cry again, your father is just looking at this work, and it's all, you know, destroyed. And it's like, that's, you know, it's not about Serbs and Muslims, and it's just showing this madness, you know, destruction. And this is, I think, what you do so wonderfully, and what I tried to show in some way.
Thank you. That's very nice. I didn't expect this, so I'm now untouched. To your point, I think, I mean, people in diaspora read my books too, and I think one of the reasons is that people like us, immigrants, and also non-normative populations, people of color and people, you know, so-called minorities, right? We are often in a position we have to explain ourselves to others, right? The normative populations. Who are you? Where are you from? Or why are you like that? Depending who you are. And so for what diaspora uses our books for is they can point at something. I mean, when they ask me to explain myself, I write a book. And so that's the easiest and the fastest way. But then the people who are of the same background, belong to the same historical experience, can show these books and say, well, this might help you understand who I am. And so there's always an assumption of mutual understanding in diaspora, I think. Whereas back home, it's more complicated. Let me ask you this. This is a question from Thea Obrecht. You've spoken about the challenge of engaging. She is indeed. She is one of ours. engaging with your own work. You've spoken about the challenges of engaging with your own work across languages. Can you talk a little bit about your work across forms? What are the rewards or challenges you find in writing short stories versus a novel?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love short stories. I prefer to write short stories, and I think when I'm writing a short story, I really feel like I'm a worker. I'm working. I'm trying to perfect something. As you all already know, I mean, it's almost a commonplace to talk about it, but like there's nothing can be out of place. Everything kind of stands out if it's superfluous. So I really like to work with them, and then some of them are good, some of them are not so good. And you feel better. It just, to me, it kind of brings me closer to this whole craft of writing. And it's hard for me to talk about what it's like to write a novel. I've only written one. I mean, this is something you should ask Sasha, but it was a completely different experience. It was almost obsessive, and I wasn't able to do much else. I was just kind of constantly inside this, and I was moving faster than I would with a collection of short stories. It was much different, but it's not that I sit down thinking I want to write a novel or I want to write a short story. It's just I think of a problem or some sort of, I like to call it a center. I like to have a kind of center of the narrative, the text, and then that theme or that image. Sometimes it can be a sentence, sometimes it's a person. The topic itself is going to tell you how much space it needs. I think it has more to do with the market. Thinking about it as short story, it's 10,000 words maximum. Then novella, it's etc. Novel, this is gonna sell better, etc. But you have to be true to the story that you're trying to tell, and then see, how long or how short it should be. So what happened with this novel is that it started growing, and it was as a short story, it would have been banal to tackle so many different issues in less than 10,000 words. So it just kind of, but after that, I just went immediately back to writing short stories, because I needed to first kind of cleanse my palate and get rid of Sara's voice, because I don't want to repeat that voice, but also to remind myself, okay, you go back to your workshop, and you work and you tell stories. That's what you do. Don't fall in love with yourself, because now you have a novel and whatnot. Like, you're a worker, you can fail, you can do it well, you can do it not so well. So it felt really good to go back to short stories, and I think I'm gonna definitely keep writing them. And then when I have to write a novel in order to survive, or the story just asks for it, definitely. Poetry, no, never again. That was a useful mistake. No.
Never say never.
There's that character that I love in Master and Margarita. I don't know how it is in Ivan Bezdomny. I think Ivan the homeless. And when Master meets him in the asylum, he makes this promise that he will never write poetry because he's such a bad poet, and I just always loved that. And they shake on it, so I always feel like, yeah, I'm like Ivan. I'm gonna be like, no, I'm not gonna do it.
Well, and you can write it before you get to the asylum, and then that's the final threshold. I watched that interview with you when you kind of define yourself as a storyteller and someone who likes to make stuff up, which sets you not quite against, but it sounded like you were not interested or committed to writing nonfiction, and I mean narrative nonfiction as opposed to essays and so on. Can you you said something wonderful, if I may paraphrase you so that you can talk more about it. It said in nonfiction, people will spot a lie as soon as it pops up, right? When in fiction, people will recognize truth. And it's such a brilliant distinction, which is, I do write nonfiction, but I prefer fiction for that reason. You have to make stuff up to arrive at the truth. Can you talk a bit about that, please?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm not, there's a lot of great art of fiction that I enjoy reading and that I like, but what I love about it is not the fact that it's really happened. And to me, this is where I kind of step back and distrust the author, is when I hear, no, this actually really happened. And usually I would say, I don't care. What I care about is how you're going to make me feel that experience. So I go through it too, this is something that you do very well, and some other writers who write nonfiction and autofiction can also do. But to me, I just felt that I just felt young, and I feel like my experience is not as interesting, and I feel like to me it's much more special to try and imagine and understand somebody else's experience. Like, there's an act of empathy there, and I feel like, of course, I'm always going to put myself into it in some way or another. You have to do it, but this act of trying to understand someone else, this is what I love about fiction, when the text can do something that no other art can do. Just imagine and play and cross boundaries. This is what I love. Some of my favorite books do this. So I do prefer to tell stories, but that's that difference, between telling the truth and doing something truthfully. I think, even if you read about two animals talking to each other, there could be some truth in that story, and the reader will be able to see whether you're faking it or actually invoking something that he or she already kind of knew to be true. So this is why I think we shouldn't forget about fiction, and we shouldn't forget about its ability to tell the truth, because I do feel that nowadays we have become obsessed with the so-called true story. Like, one thing is to be interested in people's experiences, which is important, but the other thing is to go back to this Victorian idea of truth, of this person is going to tell me the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Like, let's also remember that there's such thing as voice and narrator and reliability, etc. That it's a text and it's going to do something else. So I think we shouldn't abandon fiction for that matter. I have to say, I have been writing a lot of diaries lately for different reasons, and just recently finished one for Bosnian publisher, and it was really difficult for me to do that because it was a great exercise, and every step of the way I was kind of feeling like, yeah, this isn't serious literature, so whatever, it doesn't matter. So I kind of felt more free to do whatever I wanted, but it was a good exercise in observation and choosing what to describe and what not to describe. So yeah, I could see that it's not as easy as it looks, but still I'm gonna keep inventing things, even when I talk about myself, especially then.
Please do. I think we have a couple of more minutes, and we have one more question left. It has been partially answered, but I will ask you anyway. From James, you've talked about Joyce and Nabokov, but who are some of your other influences, and do they also have such complicated relationships with language?
Well, I mean, there's Joyce, then there's like 10 empty spots, and then there's some other writers. I don't think Joyce had a complicated relationship with language. I think it was actually quite simple. It's just it might be difficult for us to go through it, but it's a lot of fun. I always tell people, don't listen to scholars and academics. Just Joyce is a lot of fun. Just get into it, and you're gonna have fun. So yeah, I mentioned Virginia Woolf. I mentioned Nabokov. There was, of course, the great Yugoslav writer Danilo Kiš, who I think I don't think anybody writing in former Yugoslavia can skip that name, because he just did a lot of work for us, and it's all there. And what I love about that writer is that he used to say that he would say pravim knjigu. I'm making a book, not I'm writing a book, but I'm making a book, and I just love this. And every book that he wrote is different. Its form is different. The voice, there is his style, and it's very much recognizable. But he approached each project on its own, and for me, it's just I learned a lot from him. So definitely Danilo Kiš. I read a lot of poetry. I try not to write it, but I read a lot of poetry. I think it's important. I don't know if you agree, Sasha, but for fiction writers and prose writers in general, it's important to read poetry, to stay in touch with, this magnificent playground of language where really magical things happen with language. So definitely a lot of Yugoslav poets. I don't know. I love Vasko Popa, for example. I don't know, Tin Ujević, just so many. I mean, now it's I don't know if anybody's going to remember these names, but we can type them down. So yeah, a lot of poetry. I don't know. I would have to think more, but I don't want to keep you.
No, that's great. I knew you would say Vasko Popa and Danilo Kiš, and not only because I heard your interviews, but you can feel the presence of that particular tradition. In some ways, it's politically leftist, but it has an ethics and aesthetics that is defined as, even by default, as non-nationalist. And so
exactly.
people, writers, right, writers of my generation, certainly, and even your generation, which is a much younger generation, if they owe something to that tradition, they kind of automatically fall into a particular political domain, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So I wanted to ask you a little more about Joyce, because I'm a Joyce fanatic too.
Please do.
I would not say that
2 or
Finnegan's
3 more
Wake.
hours.
Yeah, so just the last question. I think we're almost done. How old were you? What did Joyce do to you when you read his work first?
So that was strange because, I remember a university professor entering the classroom and saying, we're supposed to talk about James Joyce today, but I haven't read Ulysses. I don't want to read that book, and I'm not going to make you read that book. And immediately I had this reaction: what is it about this book? Why is a university professor bragging about his decision not to read it on purpose? So I, of course, immediately after that class, I had to get that book and see what it's all about. And I was really young. I was 20, and at first I understood nothing. There's a wonderful translation by Zoran Paunović in Serbian, but I felt like and that's the book that I started with. I felt that reading the novel, my just immediate thought was, you can do this. Oh, and you can do this, and you can also do this. You can do whatever you want. There's this feeling. I don't know if it happened to you, but Joyce really shows you, like, language is here. You can. It's they say that he broke. Language is unbreakable. Like, you can. It invites you to play with it in a way. So for me, it was like, okay, I really want to get to the bottom of this, and then that book takes you to another book, and then, okay, go to Dante and read Dante, then go back here, and there's Aristotle. I'm 20. I know nothing. I only pretend to know things about Aristotle, but I know nothing about Aristotle. So go and read that. So come back. So it was like this huge journey that started then, And for the last 15 years, it hasn't stopped, and I'm really enjoying it. And of course, in the meantime, I read all the other books, and even managed to organize a reading group in Barcelona. So yeah, he has been really, really important, but also not just his work, which for me is magnificent. And I really think that writers can learn a lot from him. I think just reading Dubliners, I think everything is there, everything you need to learn. When it comes to, voice, point of view, detail, setting, dialogue, it's all there. But not just that, it was also his relationship with literature. How, the way he saw it in his life. He was really like this priestly figure, and literature was his priesthood in a way. He was going to become a priest and then change his mind. So this kind of obsession of, I'm doing serious work and I want to do it the best way that I can, and it might be crazy and nobody understands it, but I'm gonna do this because this is the way it's supposed to be done. This is what I admired and learned a lot from. And yeah, sorry, I can go on and on about Joyce, but
I totally agree with you. What the way I have been thinking about it is that what Joyce creates total literature. It has absolute demands from the reader. That is, in some ways, it's almost impossible. He demands from you to devote your entire life to understanding his book, for which you have to have read all of the books that he has read, and probably far more. And so this absolutist faith in literature, his faith in literature replaced his faith in God, right? Which is the Catholic Ireland was ruling, right? So instead of faith, there's literature. And so I love that commitment, the absolute commitment to do that. And Finnegan's Wake, of course, blew it all up, yeah.
Before I let you go, which book was it for you? What was your first Joyce?
I wrote my bachelor's thesis decades ago. We had to write a bachelor's thesis on Ulysses, and it was supposed to be a 25-page paper. And I was a good student. I could have done that, but I got so invested it took me a year and a half, and I wrote a 75-page thesis with unfolding schemes, graphs of leitmotif chains and schemes. I had this whole theory of chaos.
Oh, I love that.
Thing. And I read English and the translation. It was a Croatian translation from 1967. I became just as obsessive as he demands for a few years. And I don't reread the whole thing. I'll open chapters and pages and reread them.
And you always find something new, which is just so beautiful.
He was insane.
One of those things that you either never get into it or you never get out. So
that's right. That's that kind of demand. Right, as opposed to kind of market-driven literature where writers are, I don't want to insult or scare the reader because they might back off and never come back. His position was, fuck it, I'm going to do it, and you soon see what you can do.
Yeah, no compromise.
That's right. I think we have run out of time. Have we?
Okay.
Well, if we have not, I'll be happy to talk to Lana about Joyce until tomorrow morning. But I think. Thank you all. I greatly enjoyed this conversation. I hope you did too. I hope to speak to Lana in person, non-virtual person, one day, but that's something to look forward to.
Definitely.
Thank you both. And thank both of you so much for joining us. I think we would all love to sit here and listen to you talk about Joyce for many more hours. But I will let you both get back to your families. For everyone attending, thank you so much for listening. This was absolutely fantastic and lovely. And I hope I get to speak with you both again soon.
Great. Thanks.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.